Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about alto flute, and specifically the things that you need to think about before you buy one. And that really boils down to straight head joint versus curved head joint. Obviously, I own a curved head joint alto, and I'm going to talk about why I purchased this one over a straight head joint alto. But I'm also going to talk about the advantages of a straight head joint flute, and just the options that you have and things you need to think about before you invest in this instrument, because it is an investment and it's not gonna be something that you just do on a whim. Obviously, a curved head joint is curved and a straight head joint is straight. A straight head joint alto looks more like a large C flute. This looks more like a small bass flute. The biggest difference is the length of the instrument, which makes sense. I prefer the curved head joint because I'm a very small person. I don't have very long arms, and playing a straight head joint alto puts my wrist in a very uncomfortable position, and it puts a lot of pressure on my wrists. And I'm also prone to wrist issues, so it's not something that I want to factor into my practice schedule. So this flute allows me to play as much as I need to and as hard as I need to without having to risk extra injury to my already pretty fragile wrists. I also do, especially playing bass flute, which forces your wrist at that point, wear a brace, but I, in purchasing this one, wanted to have an instrument that was as versatile as it could for my own playing. However, some people find it really uncomfortable. It does have 2 points of motion in the head joint. You can move this joint, and you can also move this joint. It means that the setup is a little bit harder to get used to because you have to figure out where the curve goes and then where your lip plate goes. And it also does affect the tuning a little bit more because you have 2 joints to deal with, and you also have a curve which changes your air. So, in terms of adapting between C flute and a curved head joint alto, it's a little bit harder. Going from a C flute to a straight head joint alto is a lot easier because it's the same airstream. There's no changes to be made apart from the volume of air and maybe the air speed, but at least there you have the air traveling the same direction it would in a C flute, and so it's just a matter of adapting to the instrument itself and not to a completely different setup. This is the same problem that a lot of people have with bass flute, where it just doesn't react the same way. So, you have to weigh the kind of adaptation factor of the smaller flute, or shorter flute, versus you can go directly to it and the tuning is easier, but if you're small like me, it's gonna be harder to play. That's the big factor. Some people say that the sound is different. I personally don't see any difference. I've played both types and I just prefer this so much more. I think it's just because I'm a small person and it's so much harder to play for me. It's uncomfortable and I'm always thinking about the fact that my wrist hurts, and that's not good. The other thing to think about when you're considering buying an alto flute is that these guys are harder to find. A lot of makers make 3 or 4 straight head joint altos a year and maybe 1 or 2 curved head joint altos. When I bought this one, I actually contacted Altus, the maker of this instrument, and inquired what they had in stock, and they told me that they really just made like 2 or 3 a year and tended to send them out to dealers rather than selling them directly from their warehouse because they found it was easier because the dealers could hold them for longer, and they also had a wider market because something like Flute World is a lot more accessible and they have a lot more resources in terms of sending out instruments because that's what they do. When I contacted Flute World, they told me that they had one and they had just sold it. I got really lucky that flute specialists who are also based in Detroit had this one, and I loved it, but it's still something that really I didn't realize when I was going about buying one. I knew what I wanted and no one had what I wanted. So that was a thing that I didn't even think about, that these are a relatively small market instrument and you do have to kind of search for them. The straight head joint altos are still kind of niche. They're not exactly something that everyone owns, but they are much more accessible, and it seems like they make more in a year. I think it's also easier to make them because they don't have as much weirdness happening and the scale is a little bit easier to deal with. But that's just my theory. Basically, it's tuning and sound versus ease of playing, and I would really recommend trying out both and seeing which one's easier for you. A lot of universities will have multiple alto flutes, and if your university lends them out, you can see if your friend can take out one and you can take out the other and you guys can try, or maybe your teacher has one and you can try the other. Basically, it's all a really personal preference, and it comes down to which one is better for you, which is true for all flutes, but it is something to think about before you start going into the process of buying one, because, as I said, they're hard to find sometimes, and if you don't know what you want, you could end up buying an instrument that really doesn't suit you very well and could injure you. So, yeah. I hope this was helpful. If you guys like this video, give it a like. If you're new here, subscribe. If you want to support me more, check out my Patreon, and I will see you guys on Thursday.